In the quiet town of Riverstone, a storm was brewing, not the kind that darkens the skies, but one that shakes a town to its very core. At the heart of it all stood Peggy Wilson, a 90-year-old woman with silver hair, a steady gaze, and a past that no one in Riverstone truly understood. To most, she was just a kind, quiet neighbor, someone who tended her garden and sipped her coffee at Diana's diner every morning. But Peggy's calm demeanor hid a history forged in the fires of war, where courage was the only way forward. When the Shadow Vipers, a ruthless motorcycle gang led by a man named Havoc, rolled into Riverstone, everything changed. The gang seized control of the town with intimidation, violence, and fear, leaving businesses shattered and people afraid to step outside their doors. It seemed like no one could stand up to them until one fateful day, when the Vipers picked the wrong person to cross. Peggy, who had once faced enemies far more dangerous than a gang of bullies, knew what had to be done. With one phone call, she reached out to an old friend, Iron Jack, leader of the Veterans Guard, a group of combat-hardened bikers with loyalty forged on distant battlefields. What started as a fight for survival quickly became something much greater, a fight for Riverstone's soul. But standing up to bullies comes with a price. As the Veterans Guard and the townspeople began to push back, the Shadow Vipers escalated their threats, determined to crush anyone who stood in their way. Amid broken windows and smoldering ruins, unlikely heroes emerged, people like Snake, a young member of the gang who began to question the life he had chosen. In a town torn apart, Peggy's wisdom and unwavering belief in the power of unity became a beacon of hope. Margaret Peggy Wilson woke before dawn, as she always did. At 90 years old, Peggy's routines were her anchor habits she had carried with her since the war. Her modest home sat at the edge of Riverstone, Virginia, surrounded by patches of wild grass and an old oak tree that had stood longer than the house itself. It was a humble two-bedroom structure with faded blue shutters, a small front porch with a rocking chair, and shelves filled with photographs that whispered stories of her past. The air in Riverstone was still that morning, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Peggy pushed open the creaky screen door and stepped outside, a cup of black coffee warming her hands. The silence stretched across the empty streets, broken only by the faint chirping of birds. She looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of sunrise spread like a soft blush across the sky. Peggy's life was quiet now, but not lonely. She had grown used to the solitude, even embraced it. Her late husband, Bill, had passed nearly 20 years ago, and their only son lived across the country in Oregon. They talked occasionally, but Peggy rarely complained about the distance. After all, she was not one to dwell on what she could not change. Inside the house, she carefully pinned her silver hair into its usual neat bun and dressed in her simple cardigan and slacks, her uniform of sorts. Each day, Peggy followed a rhythm: morning coffee, a drive into town, breakfast at Diana's diner, and then her meetings at the VA Center. These veteran gatherings meant everything to her. It was a place where people understood, where her memories of Vietnam were not just whispers of a forgotten past. Peggy grabbed her worn leather purse, slipping her car keys inside. The keys were attached to a simple tag engraved with the words, "Never forget, a gift from an old friend." She stepped outside and eased herself into her aging Ford Taurus. The engine rumbled to life, filling the early silence as Peggy backed out of the driveway. Riverstone was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, at least. That was how it used to be. Brick buildings lined Main Street, their facades faded but sturdy. The diner, the barber shop, and Tom Mason's hardware store stood as pillars of Riverstone's history. But lately, things had begun to change. Small businesses were closing, families were leaving, and a dark cloud seemed to hang over the town. Peggy parked in her usual spot in front of Diana's diner. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and the smell of bacon and fresh coffee greeted her like an old friend. Diana herself stood behind the counter, her graying curls pinned back and her apron dusted with flour. "Morning, Peggy," Diana called out with a smile. "Your usual?" Peggy nodded and slid into her favorite booth near the window. She loved this spot. From here, she could watch the street come alive. Each morning, the quiet gave way to people moving in and out of stores, children riding bikes, and delivery trucks rumbling down the road. Jimmy, the young server who had worked at the diner since high school, brought her coffee and a plate of eggs. "Morning, Mrs. Wilson," he said cheerfully. "Busy day ahead?" Peggy smiled warmly. "Nothing I cannot handle, Jimmy." The boy's kindness always brightened her mornings. She often wondered if he knew just how much those simple gestures meant. Peggy's day continued like clockwork. After breakfast, she drove to the VA Center, a place that anchored her as much as the diner did. The center sat just outside the town square, its walls covered with photos of Riverstone's veterans, men and women who had served in wars across decades. There were pictures of young soldiers standing proudly in their uniforms, their eyes filled with hope. Peggy spent the morning in quiet conversations with friends who shared her past. Veterans like Sarah Chen, who had served during the Gulf War and now led support groups for younger vets. Peggy admired Sarah's dedication, her determination to help others heal. Sarah often joked that Peggy was the glue holding the group together. But beneath the familiar conversations and camaraderie, something felt different that day. There was a weight in the air, a tension Peggy could not quite place. "You hear about that motorcycle gang?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence as they sat by the window sipping coffee. "The Shadow Vipers?" Peggy frowned slightly. "I have seen their bikes around town, loud and flashy." "Why?" "They have been making trouble for businesses," Sarah replied, her voice low. "Harassing shop owners, demanding protection money. Tom Mason said they came into his store yesterday. He told them to get lost, but he looked shaken." Peggy's brows knitted in concern. Riverstone had always been peaceful, but it sounded like something darker was creeping in. That afternoon, Peggy decided to stop by Mason's hardware store. Tom Mason had inherited the store from his father, and it was one of the oldest businesses in town. When Peggy arrived, she found Tom sitting behind the counter, staring at a crack in the wooden floor. "Tom," Peggy said gently, as she approached, "how are you holding up?" Tom looked up, his face etched with worry. "Peggy," he said with a weak smile, "I am fine. Just a long day." She did not believe him, and her instincts told her to dig deeper. "I heard about the trouble you had yesterday." Tom sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "Those bikers, the Shadow Vipers, they came in here demanding money, said it was for protection. I told them to leave, but, Peggy, they are dangerous. What if they come back?" Peggy studied Tom for a moment. He looked so defeated, as if the weight of the world had fallen on his shoulders. The store was more than a business to him, it was his family's legacy. She thought of all the years she had spent flying missions in Vietnam, of the fear she had faced and overcome. She saw that same fear in Tom's eyes. "Tom," Peggy said softly, "this town is stronger than you think. Do not let them take your hope." He looked at her, uncertain. "What can I do? They are too strong." Peggy shook her head. "Strength does not come from fear. It comes from standing together." She left the store soon after, but as she climbed into her car, she felt uneasy. Riverstone was changing. The Shadow Vipers were like a storm cloud rolling over the town, and Peggy knew storms did not go away on their own. That evening, Peggy sat on her front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The town was quiet again, but it no longer felt peaceful. She thought about Tom Mason and the look of despair on his face. She thought about the other small business owners who might be too afraid to speak up. Peggy looked down at the small leather keychain in her hands. It was worn from years of use, but the words, "Never forget," were still visible. It was a reminder of promises she had made long ago. of lives she had fought to save. As night fell over Riverstone, Peggy decided she would not sit back and watch as her town was swallowed by fear. She had faced far worse in her lifetime, and she would face this too. The next morning, Peggy drove back to Mason's hardware store before the sun rose. The streets were empty, the quiet hanging heavy in the air. She parked in front of the shop, pulled out a small slip of paper, and wrote a note. "Do not give up hope. You are stronger than you know. You are not alone." She folded the note carefully and slipped it under the store's door. It was a small act, just a few words, but Peggy knew that sometimes unexpected kindness could make all the difference. As she climbed back into her car, she glanced down the empty street. For now, Riverstone was quiet. But Peggy knew that a storm was coming, and she would be ready. Peggy's car rumbled down Main Street the next morning, the old Taurus moving steadily along roads she had traveled for decades. The town was beginning to stir. Diana's diner had its usual customers seated at the counter, sipping coffee and chatting softly. Children with backpacks walked along the cracked sidewalks toward the school. On the surface, Riverstone looked like the same sleepy town Peggy had always known. But there was a shadow spreading across it, creeping in slowly, the kind of shadow that did not just disappear with the morning light. Peggy parked her car in front of Mason's hardware store. She watched from her window for a moment, waiting to see signs of life. Eventually, Tom Mason appeared behind the glass door. He looked more put together today, though his shoulders still carried the weight of yesterday's confrontation. Peggy noticed the note she had slipped under his door, pinned on the wall behind the counter. When she stepped inside, the old bell above the door chimed. Tom looked up, his expression softening when he recognized her. "Morning, Peggy," he said, managing a faint smile. "What brings you by so early?" Peggy walked toward the counter, her steps steady. "Just checking in on a friend." Tom nodded, though the tiredness still lingered in his eyes. "I am getting through it," he said. His voice was firm, but lacked conviction. "I found your note this morning. I appreciate it." Peggy tilted her head, watching him closely. Sometimes a few words are all we need to remind us that we are not alone. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but the faint, distant sound of motorcycle engines cut through the quiet. Peggy's expression sharpened. The sound grew louder, a slow rumble that rolled through the streets like distant thunder. Tom stiffened, his eyes darting toward the window. "Peggy," he said quietly, his voice edged with worry. "You should go." Peggy turned her head slightly, catching sight of the bikes rolling into view. There were 5 of them this time, their chrome frames glinting harshly under the sunlight. The riders wore black leather jackets adorned with the red insignia of a coiled viper. At the center of the group rode Havoc, his face partially obscured by dark sunglasses, his posture exuding confidence and cruelty. The motorcycles came to a stop in front of the store. The engines idled menacingly as Havoc dismounted his bike. He removed his sunglasses, revealing cold, calculating eyes that fixed on Mason's hardware like a predator stalking prey. "Stay behind the counter, Tom," Peggy said softly, her voice steady. Tom's brow furrowed. "Peggy, you do not have to—" "I do," she cut him off gently. "This is not just about you anymore." Havoc's boots echoed against the pavement as he approached the entrance. The bell above the door jangled harshly when he stepped inside, shattering the stillness of the room. Peggy remained where she was, standing calmly in the aisle as Havoc's sharp gaze settled on her. "Well, well," Havoc said, his voice a smooth drawl. "You again." Peggy did not flinch under his scrutiny. "Morning." Havoc smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Where is Mason?" he demanded, glancing around the room. "I am here to collect what he owes." Tom stepped forward from behind the counter, his voice shaking but resolute. "I already told you yesterday. I am not paying for your protection. Now get out of my store." Havoc's smirk vanished, replaced by something darker. He took a step toward Tom, his tone lowering. You are making a mistake, old man. Accidents happen, shops burn down, people get hurt. Peggy's voice broke through the tension like steel. You call that protection? Havoc turned his head slowly to face her. For a moment, the room fell silent, except for the low hum of the motorcycles still idling outside. What did you say? Havoc asked, his voice dangerously soft. Peggy stepped forward, her posture straight and unwavering. You think fear makes you strong. It does not. All you are doing is destroying a town that has done nothing to deserve it. Havoc studied her, his expression unreadable. You talk big for someone your age. Peggy met his gaze without blinking. I have seen men like you before, men who mistake cruelty for strength. You are not as new or as scary as you think. Havoc's jaw tightened. He took another step toward her, his hand twitching at his side. Careful, lady. You do not know who you are talking to. But Peggy stood her ground, her calm composure throwing him off balance. The war had taught her to face danger head-on, to stand tall even when fear tried to take hold. She could see it now, the flicker of uncertainty in Havoc's eyes, the way her stillness unsettled him. The bell rang again as one of the younger gang members entered the store. It was James "Snake" Lewis, his face half hidden by a bandana tied loosely around his neck. He was younger than the others, barely in his 20s, and Peggy noticed how his eyes darted nervously around the room. Unlike Havoc, there was no malice in his gaze, only doubt. Havoc, Snake muttered, shifting uncomfortably. We should go. Havoc shot him a glare. What did you say? Snake hesitated, looking from Peggy to Tom and back again. This is not worth it. Let's just go. For a moment, Peggy thought Havoc might strike the boy. But instead, Havoc sneered and turned his attention back to her. This is not over, Havoc said, his voice low and threatening. You will regret this. Peggy did not reply. She simply watched as Havoc turned and stormed out of the store, his boots clanging loudly against the wooden floor. Snake followed him, casting one last uncertain glance at Peggy before disappearing through the door. Moments later, the motorcycles roared to life, their engines echoing down the empty street until silence returned once more. Tom let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the counter as if to steady himself. Peggy, he said, his voice trembling. Why did you do that? You could have gotten hurt. Peggy turned to face him, her expression soft but firm. Because bullies only win when good people do nothing. Tom nodded, though his shoulders were still slumped under the weight of it all. What happens now? Peggy's gaze drifted toward the window, where the last wisps of dust still lingered in the wake of the motorcycles. She knew Havoc's kind. They did not back down easily. This would not be the end of it. They will be back, Peggy admitted. But so will we. Tom looked at her, confusion etched into his features. What do you mean? Peggy smiled faintly. I am not the only one who has faced men like Havoc. She left the store soon after, her mind already made up. The Shadow Vipers had brought fear to Riverstone, but Peggy would not let that fear take hold. She thought of her old friends, men and women who had faced far greater odds and survived. Somewhere out there, Iron Jack Morrison and the Veterans Guard were still waiting for her call. As Peggy climbed into her car and turned the key, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before she began to dial a familiar number, one she had not called in decades. Jack, she said when the line connected. It is Peggy. I need your help. That night, Peggy sat on her porch, the phone call still echoing in her ears. Iron Jack had not hesitated. His voice had been calm and steady, just as she remembered it. We will be there, he had promised. Give us 24 hours. The wind rustled through the leaves of the oak tree, carrying with it the distant hum of engines, an echo of what was to come. Peggy closed her eyes, her mind flashing back to Vietnam. She remembered the roar of helicopter blades, the hiss of gunfire, and the faces of the men she had saved. She remembered the fear, the exhaustion, and the way courage had always carried them through. Tomorrow Riverstone would face its storm, but Peggy was no stranger to storms. As the night deepened, the town fell into uneasy silence. The Shadow Vipers believed they owned Riverstone now, but they were wrong. Peggy Wilson had called for backup, and help was on the way. Peggy's mind was unusually restless that night. The quiet hum of her old house felt different now, heavier somehow. Outside, the wind rattled the branches of the old oak tree, but Peggy remained seated at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. It was late, but sleep felt impossible. She had made the call, and now the wheels were in motion. Iron Jack had promised they would come. Those words replayed in her mind. "We will be there." It had been years since Peggy had spoken to him, decades, in fact, but the connection between them remained unbroken, forged in the jungles of Vietnam where trust had been the only currency worth anything. Peggy reached for an old tin box on the shelf above the table. She carefully lifted the lid, revealing faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a few medals that gleamed even in the dim kitchen light. The memories sat heavy in her hands. One picture caught her eye, Iron Jack, as a young lieutenant, grinning beside her after they had pulled off a near-impossible rescue mission. They were covered in grime, their smiles exhausted, but genuine. "Jack," Peggy murmured softly to herself, running a finger over the photo. "We made it through that mess. We'll get through this one, too." The next morning, Riverstone seemed unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. The sunlight filtered down softly, casting golden streaks across the streets. Businesses opened, residents bustled about their day, and children laughed as they ran toward the school. To anyone passing through, the town looked peaceful. Peggy, however, knew better. She could feel it, a slow, creeping tension just below the surface. She arrived at Diana's diner as usual, the bell above the door chiming gently. The smell of fresh bacon and coffee welcomed her, but this morning there was a nervous edge to the conversations in the diner. She could hear whispers, murmurs about the Shadow Vipers, and the trouble at Tom Mason's hardware store. "Morning, Peggy." Diana greeted her warmly, though the strain was visible on her face. She poured Peggy a cup of coffee, her hands a little less steady than usual. Peggy offered a small smile in return. "Morning, Diana." She lowered her voice, glancing around the diner. "Have they been back?" Diana sighed. "Not here, thank God, but I heard they showed up at Pete's auto shop last night. Broke a few windows, slashed some tires. Pete said he's shutting down until it blows over." Peggy's jaw tightened. The Vipers were pushing harder, testing the town's limits. Fear was spreading like an infection, seeping into every corner of Riverstone. Before Peggy could respond, the diner door opened with a jangle, and a young man stepped inside. It was James "Snake" Lewis, the gang member who had tried to convince Havoc to leave Mason's store. He looked different today. His leather jacket was zipped up tightly, his head hung low, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. Snake spotted Peggy and hesitated, but something pushed him forward. He walked over to her booth, glancing at Diana behind the counter. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly, his voice uncertain. Peggy looked at him carefully before nodding. "Go ahead." Snake slid into the seat across from her, his hands fidgeting on the table. He looked younger up close, barely more than a kid. His face had the hardened look of someone who had been through more than his years should allow. Snake started, then trailed off, looking out the window as if checking to see if anyone had followed him. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I didn't know what else to do. I think I need help." Peggy tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "Help with what?" Snake swallowed hard. "Getting out. I didn't sign up for what Havoc's doing. When I joined the Vipers, it was just about riding. Brotherhood, you know? But this is different. It's not what I wanted." Peggy studied the boy's face. Beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else, hope, maybe, though he was trying hard to hide it. "You're scared," Peggy said gently. Snake nodded, shame flickering across his face. "Yeah, Havoc's losing it. He's getting meaner. I heard him talking about you yesterday, about how you humiliated him at Mason's. He's planning something, but I don't know what." Peggy's expression darkened. She leaned in closer. "Why are you telling me this?" Snake hesitated. "Because of what you said, about strength not coming from fear. No one's ever said anything like that to me before. You stood up to him, and you didn't blink. That—" He paused, searching for the words. "That kind of courage, maybe I can find it too." Peggy felt a stirring in her chest, a mixture of sadness and hope. She had seen boys like Snake before, young men searching for belonging in all the wrong places. She reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "You already have it," she said softly. "It took courage to come here." Snake's eyes darted to her hand, and for a moment he looked like he might break down, but he steadied himself, clearing his throat. "I just want out," he mumbled. "If Havoc finds out I talked to you, I'm done for." Peggy nodded. "You did the right thing coming to me. But listen carefully, things are going to change. The Viper's days in Riverstone are numbered." Snake looked at her in disbelief. "You don't know Havoc. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Peggy's eyes narrowed. "Then he'll learn the hard way that this town isn't his to take." Before Snake could respond, the sound of approaching motorcycles echoed down Main Street. His face paled instantly. "They're here." Peggy glanced out the window. 4 motorcycles pulled to a stop in front of the diner. Havoc wasn't with them, but the riders wore the same black leather jackets with the red Viper insignia. They dismounted their bikes, looking around the street with an air of arrogance. Snake shot up from his seat, panic in his eyes. "I have to go." "Where?" Peggy asked sharply. "Anywhere but here." Snake hurried toward the diner's back exit, mumbling a hurried, "Thank you," before disappearing through the door. The bikers entered the diner, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Peggy turned back to her coffee, unflinching as they scanned the room. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard, strode up to her booth. "You," he growled, pointing a finger at her. "Havoc wants a word." Peggy met his glare with calm defiance. "Well, I am busy having breakfast. Tell him he can wait." The man's face twisted in anger. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the coffee cup. "Watch your mouth, lady. You don't know who you're dealing with." Diana stepped out from behind the counter, her voice sharp. "You leave her alone, or I'll call the sheriff." The man turned his glare on Diana, but before he could respond, Peggy's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Go back to your leader and tell him this," Peggy said, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of him, and this town doesn't belong to him." The biker stared at her for a long moment, his expression dark and unreadable. Finally, he sneered and turned to leave, muttering curses under his breath. As the bikers left, the tension in the diner eased. Diana walked over, her face pale but determined. "Peggy, what are you doing? They're dangerous." Peggy looked out the window, watching the motorcycles roar back down the street. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you have to stand up to the storm, no matter how strong it seems." That afternoon, Peggy waited on her porch. She could hear it long before she saw them, the distant rumble of engines, steady and disciplined. Moments later, the first glint of chrome appeared down the road, and a line of motorcycles came into view. They were not like the Shadow Vipers. There was no chaos in their formation, no arrogance in the way they rode. At the front of the group was Iron Jack Morrison, his silver hair catching the sunlight as he slowed his bike in front of Peggy's house. He removed his helmet, grinning as he climbed off. "Still stirring up trouble, are you?" he teased. Peggy smiled faintly. "Someone has to." Iron Jack stepped forward, his expression turning serious as he looked around. "You called, Peggy. We're here. Now tell me what's the plan." Peggy looked out toward the horizon, where the storm was building. "First," she said, "we take back this town." Peggy stood on her front porch as the last of the motorcycles rolled to a stop. The sound of engines faded into silence, replaced by the hum of insects and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The Veterans Guard had arrived, their presence filling the sleepy street with quiet strength. Each rider dismounted with practiced ease, their movements sharp and purposeful. These men and women were no ordinary bikers. They carried themselves with the kind of calm authority that came from facing far greater battles than any the Shadow Vipers could ever dream of waging. At the center of it all stood David "Iron Jack" Morrison, his commanding presence unshaken by time. His silver hair was swept back, his rugged face marked by lines earned from years of hard living and harder choices. He looked at Peggy with a mix of admiration and concern, holding out a gloved hand. "Peggy," Jack said, his voice gravelly but kind. "It's been a long time." Peggy clasped his hand firmly. "Too long, Jack. But I knew you'd come." Jack grinned faintly, his sharp eyes scanning the quiet street. "I don't ignore a call from the best damn pilot I ever knew. Now tell me, what are we walking into?" Peggy gestured toward her porch chairs. "Come sit. There's a lot to catch up on." Inside Peggy's living room, Jack and several of his veteran bikers gathered around her worn wooden table. The room was cozy, filled with small reminders of Peggy's life, a photograph of Bill on the mantel, shelves lined with books, and the old tin box containing her medals. A kettle hissed on the stove as Sarah Chen, who had joined the Veterans Guard's arrival, poured cups of tea for everyone. Peggy leaned over the table and spread out a map of Riverstone. She had marked several locations: Tom Mason's hardware store, Pete's auto shop, Diana's diner, and other small businesses that had been targeted by the Shadow Vipers. Each red circle represented a place the gang had attacked or threatened. "The Shadow Vipers started small," Peggy explained, her finger tracing the map. "Breaking windows, harassing business owners. Now they're demanding protection money and scaring people into silence. Havoc thinks he's already won. But I'll be damned if I let him take this town." Jack studied the map, his expression hardening. "He's spreading fear. Classic bully tactics." "What about the sheriff?" Peggy shook her head. "Sheriff Keller's a good man, but he's overwhelmed. The Vipers move in packs, and Keller's department doesn't have the resources to stop them. Half the town is too scared to say anything." "Fear is a powerful weapon," Jack said, his tone grim. "But so is hope. That's why we're here." Sarah nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the map. "What's their next move?" Peggy hesitated for a moment before answering. "They'll be back at Mason's hardware. Tom stood up to them once already. Havoc will want to make an example out of him." A murmur went through the group, a mixture of anger and understanding. They had seen this before: gangs, bullies, tyrants, men who thrived on intimidation. They also knew how to handle them. Jack straightened. "All right, we'll make our stand there. How many men does Havoc have?" "At least 20, Peggy replied. "But there's more coming in from out of town. Havoc's trying to show his strength." Jack smirked. "Then let's show him what strength really looks like." The sun was just beginning to set when the Veterans Guard moved into position. Mason's hardware store sat at the corner of Main Street, its large windows already repaired from the last attack. Tom Mason stood inside, his face pale but determined, as he watched the veterans park their bikes along the curb. Each rider dismounted, taking up positions around the store with quiet precision. Jack barked orders like a commanding officer on a battlefield. "Alpha Team, cover the perimeter. Beta Team, watch the alley and back entrance. No one comes in or out without our say-so." Peggy remained by Tom's side inside the store, her presence calm and steady. She could see the relief in Tom's eyes as he watched the veterans move with discipline and purpose. For the first time in weeks, he did not look so alone. "I don't know how to thank you," Tom said quietly. Peggy placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to. Just hold your ground. Tom nodded, squaring his shoulders. I will. Outside, the street began to darken as the last light of day faded. Sarah moved through the ranks, ensuring everyone had their positions secured. The veterans were calm, their years of experience evident in every movement. They spoke in low voices, their eyes sharp as they watched the empty street. The rumble of engines came just after nightfall. At first it was faint, like the distant roll of thunder. But soon it grew louder, sharper, a sound that sent a chill through the quiet streets of Riverstone. The shadow vipers were coming. Peggy stood beside Jack at the entrance of Mason's Hardware, her sharp eyes fixed on the street. Here they come, Jack muttered. Moments later, the shadow vipers appeared, their motorcycles roaring as they rolled into view. There were at least 20 of them, led by Havoc himself. He rode at the front of the pack, his black leather jacket gleaming under the streetlights. When the bikes came to a stop, the engines idled loudly, filling the air with a low growl. Havoc dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate. The other gang members followed, their postures confident, almost cocky. They clearly did not expect resistance. Peggy stepped forward, with Jack at her side. Havoc's cold eyes locked onto her immediately. You again, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. I should have known you wouldn't know when to quit. Peggy didn't blink. It's you who doesn't know when to quit, son. This town doesn't belong to you. Havoc laughed bitterly. Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we own it already. Jack stepped forward, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once led men through combat. You don't own anything here. Now pack up your little circus and ride out of town. Havoc's expression twisted in anger. Or what? You think a bunch of old men and women are going to stop us? Jack's smile was faint and humorless. Try us. For a moment, the two sides faced each other in the middle of the street, Havoc's gang on one side, the Veterans Guard on the other. The air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Havoc stepped closer, his voice lowering. You're making a mistake, old man. Walk away now, and maybe we'll let you keep your teeth. Jack's smile faded. Son, I've faced men a lot scarier than you. We're not going anywhere. Havoc's face turned dark with fury. Get them! The bikers surged forward, but the Veterans Guard was ready. In an instant, the street exploded into chaos. Veterans stepped in, blocking the gang's advance with controlled precision. They didn't need weapons or violence, just their discipline and their presence. Some of the younger gang members hesitated, unsure of themselves as the veterans stood their ground. Havoc swung a fist toward Jack, but Jack sidestepped, grabbing Havoc's arm and twisting it with practiced ease. Havoc stumbled, cursing as he pulled free. Peggy watched it all unfold, standing firm at the entrance of the store. She saw the confusion in the eyes of some of the shadow vipers, particularly one young man, Snake. He stood frozen in the middle of the street, torn between the chaos and something deeper. Snake! Havoc shouted, spotting him. Get over here! But Snake didn't move. His gaze drifted toward Peggy, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Snake, Peggy said softly, her voice carrying even through the noise. You don't have to do this. The boy hesitated, his face conflicted. Finally, he turned and ran away from Havoc, away from the fight. Havoc's fury exploded. Coward! He screamed after Snake, but the boy was already gone. The fight quickly fizzled out as the shadow vipers realized they were outmatched. One by one, they backed off, retreating to their bikes. Havoc glared at Peggy and Jack, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over, he snarled. You hear me? This isn't over. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm. It is for tonight. Now get out of here. Reluctantly, the vipers mounted their bikes and roared away into the darkness, leaving the streets silent once more. As the dust settled, Tom Mason stepped out of his store, his face filled with disbelief. "You did it," he said softly. Peggy smiled faintly. "No, Tom, we did it." Jack walked over, clapping Peggy on the shoulder. "First stand's over, but this fight isn't done." Peggy nodded, looking down the street where the Vipers had disappeared. "No, it isn't, but now Riverstone knows we won't back down." The town of Riverstone felt a brief, almost fragile sense of relief after the Shadow Vipers retreated that night. For the first time in weeks, the residents allowed themselves to breathe. Word spread quickly about what had happened at Mason's hardware store. People spoke of the veterans' guard, of how they had stood firm against Havoc and his men, without throwing a single punch. Peggy sat on her porch the next morning, rocking slowly in her chair, sipping her coffee as the town stirred to life. The sun cast soft golden light over the streets, and for a moment, it felt like Riverstone might finally be finding its way back to peace. But Peggy knew better. Storms always come back. She set her mug down on the porch railing and gazed at the oak tree. A small wind rustled through its branches, and memories surfaced: the quiet whir of helicopter blades over thick jungle canopy, the crackle of radio static in her ears, the sound of voices shouting through gunfire. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and those instincts were telling her that Havoc was far from done. At Diana's diner later that morning, the conversation buzzed louder than usual. Residents whispered in small groups, sharing what they had heard about the events of the previous night. Tom Mason sat in a booth by the window, looking calmer than Peggy had seen him in days. "You should have seen them," Tom said proudly to a group of locals gathered near him. "Peggy and those veterans didn't blink an eye. Sent those bikers packing without breaking a sweat." Diana, ever the optimist, poured coffee for a table of regulars and added cheerfully, "Maybe that'll be the last of them. Bullies like that tend to back down when they realize people aren't afraid anymore." Peggy, sitting at her usual booth, said nothing. She stirred her coffee thoughtfully, letting the others talk. Next to her, Sarah Chen leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "They won't stop, Peggy," Sarah said quietly. "Not until they get their revenge. Havoc's not the type to let this go." Peggy looked up, her expression calm but serious. "I know." Meanwhile, across town, Havoc sat in the center of the Shadow Viper's warehouse, his jaw clenched tight, his hands curled into fists. The warehouse, a decaying structure on the edge of Riverstone, served as their headquarters, a dimly lit space filled with oil-stained floors, rows of bikes, and the sharp smell of gasoline. The air crackled with tension. Havoc paced back and forth, his boots thudding against the concrete. Around him, the gang members were unusually quiet, avoiding his glare. Most of them had never seen Havoc lose control before, and the events of the previous night had shaken their confidence. "Do you see what they did?" Havoc's voice broke the silence, rough and bitter. "That old woman and her little band of veterans made fools out of us. They humiliated us in front of this whole town." Snake James Lewis stood at the edge of the group, his hands shoved into his pockets. He kept his head down, not daring to meet Havoc's gaze. His heart hammered in his chest. He knew Peggy was right. He did not have to do this anymore. But walking away from the Vipers meant walking into the unknown. "You think this is over?" Havoc shouted, his voice rising. "We'll show them what happens when you embarrass us." A man named Diesel, Havoc's second-in-command, stepped forward cautiously. "What's the plan, boss?" Havoc's lip curled into a sneer. "We hit them where it hurts. We take their town piece by piece until there's nothing left." Havoc turned his gaze to Snake, narrowing his eyes. "And you're going to help us." Snake's head jerked up. "Me? You know where they are, where they meet, where they go. You've been watching them, haven't you?" Havoc stepped closer, his tone dangerously low. "Unless you've been hiding something from me." Snake felt the weight of Havoc's suspicion pressing down on him. I don't know much," he stammered. "They don't exactly tell me things." Havoc's gaze lingered on him for a long, uncomfortable moment before he turned away. Fine. Then you can make yourself useful another way. We'll start with their friends, any business that helped them. Mason's Hardware, Diana's Diner. That's where we begin. Snake's stomach twisted. He wanted to stop it, to warn them somehow. But surrounded by the gang, with Havoc's cold eyes watching his every move, he said nothing. At Mason's Hardware store that afternoon, Peggy stood alongside Tom as the veterans' guard moved supplies into the back room. After the events of the night before, Jack had assigned a few of his men to patrol the area and keep watch. Jack's men won't let anything happen here, Peggy assured Tom, watching the veterans outside. Tom nodded, though he still looked uneasy. It's not just me I'm worried about. What about Diana? Or Pete? Or the folks at the VA center? What if they come for them too? They might, Peggy admitted, her voice steady. But if we stand together, they won't win. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Peggy said gently. But sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing of all. Before Tom could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Peggy turned sharply toward the window. Across the street, Diana's Diner was under attack. 2 shadow vipers had smashed the front window with crowbars and were now spraying graffiti across the diner's walls. Diana, Peggy whispered, her heart tightening. Jack appeared at her side instantly, his voice firm. We'll handle this. Stay here. Peggy shook her head. I'm coming with you. Jack gave her a long look, but there was no arguing with Peggy Wilson. Together they strode out onto the street as Jack's men quickly surrounded the diner. The bikers, startled by the sudden arrival of the veterans' guard, dropped their cans of spray paint and scrambled to their bikes. Go on! Run! Jack shouted, his voice like a thunderclap. The 2 bikers roared away on their motorcycles, leaving behind shattered glass and smeared red paint across the diner's walls. Diana emerged from inside, a dish towel clutched in her hands. She looked at the damage, her face pale but defiant. Are you all right? Peggy asked, stepping up to her. Diana nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. I'm fine. It's just a window. Peggy placed a hand on her shoulder. It's more than that. It's intimidation, but they won't win. Jack walked up, his jaw tight with anger. This is Havoc's response. He's pushing harder now, testing us. And we'll push back, Peggy said firmly. Jack looked at her, his expression softening. You really think this town can take it? Peggy's gaze swept across the street, where several residents had gathered to watch. Tom Mason stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression torn between anger and fear. Others whispered nervously among themselves, their faces uncertain. We don't have a choice, Peggy replied quietly. Havoc thinks fear will break this town. We'll prove him wrong. That night, as Peggy sat on her porch again, she saw shadows moving at the edge of her property. A motorcycle engine revved once before falling silent. Peggy's hands gripped the arms of her rocking chair, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. I know you're out there, she said softly, and I'm not afraid of you. The sound of the engine faded into the night, but Peggy knew it was far from over. Havoc was testing her resolve, inching closer each day, but Peggy Wilson had faced far worse. The Vipers had no idea what kind of storm they were up against. Inside, Peggy picked up her phone and dialed Sarah. Sarah, she said firmly, we need to prepare. They're coming back, and this time they'll hit harder. The next day, Riverstone woke to fresh signs of Havoc's fury. Mason's Hardware still stood, but Diana's Diner bore deep scars, broken glass littered the sidewalk, and the words, "Get out," had been smeared in bright red paint across the wall. Pete's auto shop, already struggling to stay open, had been hit overnight too. Tires slashed, equipment destroyed. Peggy stood outside Diana's Diner, helping sweep glass into a dustpan, while Diana scrubbed at the graffiti with determined, rough strokes. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the quiet street, but the damage felt louder than ever. Diana paused, wiping sweat from her brow. "They think this will make me close," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "They think they'll scare us out." "They won't," Peggy said quietly, straightening. "They're trying to break our spirit, Diana. That's all bullies ever do." "People are scared, Peggy," Diana replied, her tone softening, "and I don't blame them. Fear has a way of creeping in, of making people look the other way." Peggy looked at the red paint smeared across the bricks and the boarded-up window. She had seen this before, not in Riverstone, but far away in Vietnam. She remembered the fear in her soldiers' eyes when things seemed hopeless, when everything looked lost, and she remembered what it took to pull them through courage, one small act at a time. "They don't know how strong they are yet," Peggy said softly, almost to herself. "But they will." At the Veterans Guard's temporary headquarters in the Old Town Hall, Jack and his men were busy. Maps of Riverstone covered the walls, each marked with pins showing recent attacks. Jack stood at the center of the room, his hands resting on the table, as Sarah Chen reported the morning's findings. "They hit 3 businesses overnight," Sarah said, gesturing at the map. "Pete's auto shop is down. He says he's done, wants to close up and leave town." Jack's face hardened. "That's what Havoc wants, to make us feel like leaving is our only choice." Sarah nodded grimly. "If he succeeds with Pete, others will follow. This town's already on edge." Peggy entered the room then, her step steady despite the weight of the situation. She surveyed the grim faces of the veterans, men and women who had stood tall in far darker moments. "Pete won't be the last unless we do something," Peggy said, her voice steady. "Havoc's turning up the heat because he's afraid. He's afraid of us, and he's afraid of this town realizing it doesn't need him." Jack turned to her, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "What do you propose, Peggy?" Peggy stepped closer to the map, her sharp eyes scanning the pins. "We hit back, but not with fists, not with violence. That's what he wants. We fight with unity. We remind this town that we stand together." Jack arched a brow. "And how do we do that?" "Tomorrow morning, we rebuild," Peggy said. "Every business they hit, every piece of glass they shattered, we'll fix it together. Veterans, residents, business owners, we all pitch in. We show Havoc and his men that Riverstone doesn't back down." There was a murmur of agreement from the veterans gathered in the room. Jack nodded slowly, the hint of a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You're talking about fighting back with hope." Peggy met his gaze. "Hope is stronger than fear, Jack. It always has been." By midday, Riverstone's streets were alive with movement. Peggy, Jack, and Sarah had spent the morning spreading the word. Veterans Guard members rode through town, visiting homes, shops, and businesses, calling on the residents to come together. It started slowly. Tom Mason arrived first, wheeling out a cart of tools from his hardware store. Diana followed, carrying supplies for fixing the diner's windows. Then Pete showed up, despite the damage to his shop, bringing a box of tools and spare parts. "I figured if you all could fight back, so can I," Pete said, giving Peggy a nod. One by one, the townspeople arrived. Mothers with their children, elderly residents, shop owners, and even teenagers who normally kept to themselves, all began working side by side with the veterans. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as shattered windows were replaced. Broken signs were repainted. Graffiti was scrubbed away. The Shadow Vipers had left their mark, but Riverstone refused to let it stay. Peggy worked alongside Sarah, scrubbing the last of the red paint off Diana's diner. Across the street, Jack supervised repairs at Pete's auto shop, his gravelly voice encouraging the volunteers. The veterans, calm and steady as always, brought a sense of order to the chaos. For hours, Riverstone rebuilt itself. From the far edge of town, Snake watched it all unfold. He stood at the corner of a side street, his motorcycle parked beside him. the leather jacket with the Shadow Viper insignia feeling heavier than ever. Snake had told himself that Havoc was too strong to fight, that resistance was useless. But as he watched the residents of Riverstone work side by side with the veterans, something shifted inside him. These were people who had every reason to be afraid, yet they had shown up anyway. He thought of Peggy's words. "You don't have to do this." Maybe she was right. Maybe there was another way. By sunset, the town looked different. Mason's Hardware had new glass in its windows. Pete's auto shop, though still scarred, had its doors open again. Diana's diner glowed warmly under the streetlights, its walls free of graffiti, its new windows gleaming. The townspeople gathered on Main Street as the day's work came to an end. There were tired smiles, laughter, and an energy that Peggy hadn't seen in Riverstone for a long time. Diana walked over to Peggy, wiping her hands on her apron. "You were right," she said softly. "We're stronger together." Peggy smiled, looking at the crowd of people, residents and veterans alike, chatting and shaking hands. "Havoc thought he could divide us," she replied, "but all he did was bring us closer." Jack approached then, his usual stoic expression softened by a rare grin. "You've done something special here, Peggy. Havoc's watching all of this, I guarantee it, and he's realizing his intimidation didn't work." Peggy nodded, her face thoughtful. "That'll make him more dangerous, Jack. He's not done." Jack's smile faded. "No, he isn't. But now, we're ready." Across town, Havoc sat in the warehouse, watching his gang through narrowed eyes. The room buzzed with frustration and uncertainty. News of Riverstone's repairs had spread quickly, and it had left the gang rattled. "They fixed everything," Diesel said, his voice edged with disbelief. "They're not backing down." Havoc's face darkened, his fists curling tightly on the table. "Then we hit them harder." "Harder?" Snake's voice broke through the tense silence. He stood at the back of the room, his hands clenched nervously at his sides. "Why? What's the point? They're just going to fight back again." Havoc turned on him sharply, his eyes cold. "You questioning me, Snake?" Snake froze, but this time he didn't look away. "I'm just saying, it's not working. Maybe it's time to—" Havoc slammed his fist against the table, silencing the room. "Enough!" he roared. "You don't think I know what's happening? That old woman and her veterans think they can embarrass us, humiliate us. Well, I'll show them. I'll show the whole town what happens when you cross the Shadow Vipers." Havoc's voice dropped into a growl, his eyes narrowing. "We're going after her next." The gang went silent. Even Diesel shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" Diesel asked cautiously. Havoc sneered. "Peggy Wilson. She started this, and now she's going to pay for it." Snake felt his heart drop, dread curling in his stomach. He glanced around the room, but no one spoke up. Havoc had made his decision. As the gang murmured among themselves, Snake slipped quietly toward the door. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to warn her. The town of Riverstone, though battered, had begun to hum with an unfamiliar resolve. Main Street's windows had been replaced, graffiti scrubbed away, and businesses stood open with a quiet defiance. It wasn't perfect. The scars of Havoc's wrath still lingered, burn marks on walls, slashed tires in alleyways, but the townspeople walked with their heads a little higher. Peggy Wilson sat in her usual place on the porch, rocking gently in her old chair, watching the last rays of the day slip beneath the horizon. Jack's Veterans Guard patrolled the streets like silent sentinels, their bikes rumbling softly through Riverstone. It brought a comfort Peggy hadn't felt in a long time, like hearing the steady beat of helicopter blades overhead, a sign that help was near. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering at the edge of her mind. Havoc was quiet today, too quiet. He was watching, waiting. And silence, Peggy knew, was often the sound of something far worse on the horizon. Her instincts proved right when, out of the shadows, a faint noise caught her ear. The gentle growl of a motorcycle, distant at first, then growing louder. Peggy leaned forward, narrowing her eyes toward the street. Moments later, a single rider emerged from the darkness, the low rumble of his bike carrying across the quiet. It wasn't one of Jack's men. The rider stopped at the end of her driveway. In the dim evening light, Peggy recognized him immediately. Snake. His figure seemed small beneath the worn leather jacket with the red coiled viper on the back. He hesitated, his engine idling, his body tense as if deciding whether to stay or turn around. Peggy set her coffee mug down and stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "Well, are you just going to sit there, or are you coming up?" she called. Snake visibly startled, his head snapping up to meet her gaze. For a moment, he looked ready to flee, but something in Peggy's voice, steady, calm, inviting, made him pull the key from the ignition. The motorcycle fell silent as Snake dismounted. He walked toward the porch with nervous, jerky steps. The boy was young, barely a man, and yet his face carried the weight of 1,000 worries. His hands were stuffed into his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched. Peggy watched him approach, her eyes sharp but kind. "You look like you've got something to say," she said as he reached the bottom of the steps. Snake hesitated, shuffling his feet on the gravel. "They're coming for you," he finally blurted out, his voice low and shaky. Peggy raised a brow. "Who's coming for me?" Snake looked around nervously, as though afraid someone might be watching. "Havoc. The others. They're planning something big. He's angry, Peggy. Real angry. Says you're the reason everything's falling apart." Peggy studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "And you're here to warn me?" Snake nodded. "Yeah. I guess." He looked down at the ground, his voice quieter now. "I don't know why I'm doing this. Maybe because you're right. About everything." Peggy's voice softened. "And what do you think I'm right about, Snake?" The boy finally looked up at her, meeting her gaze with tired eyes. "That fear doesn't make you strong. That I don't have to do this. I don't want to do this anymore." Peggy's chest tightened at the words. There it was, a flicker of hope in someone Havoc had counted on to follow him without question. She took a step forward, her voice steady. "You don't have to do this, Snake. You can walk away from all of it." Snake shook his head quickly. "It's not that simple. Havoc, he doesn't let people leave. You try to walk, he'll come after you. I've seen what he does." Peggy studied the boy in silence. She could see it clearly now, the conflict written across his face, the fear of what Havoc might do, mixed with the desperate pull toward something better. He was standing at a crossroads. She had seen men at that same crossroads before, halfway across the world, unsure if they could ever step out of the shadows. "You were brave to come here," Peggy said gently. "It takes more courage to walk away than it does to follow. You already know that, don't you?" Snake swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I think I do." Peggy tilted her head slightly. "You said Havoc's coming for me. What's he planning?" Snake hesitated again, glancing over his shoulder. "It's not just you. He's talking about blowing something up, something important. He wants to send a message to the whole town, to show everyone that he's in charge." Peggy's blood ran cold, though she kept her expression calm. "Do you know where?" Snake shook his head. "Not yet. I just heard him talking. But you've got to get out of town. If you don't—" He trailed off, his face pale. Peggy stepped closer, her voice firm but kind. "I'm not leaving, Snake. And neither are you. Not if you don't want to." Snake's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? I can't stay here. If Havoc finds out I talked to you, I'm dead." "You're not alone," Peggy replied calmly. "We'll protect you. But you've got to decide for yourself. Are you going to keep running, or are you going to stand up for something better?" The boy looked at her for a long moment, his breath uneven, his fists trembling at his sides. Finally, he looked away, his voice hoarse. I don't know if I can." Peggy placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide tonight. But know this, you're not beyond saving, Snake. None of us are." Snake looked at her with something that might have been hope, buried deep under layers of fear and doubt. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the sound of approaching motorcycles broke the silence. Snake froze, his face draining of color. "They're coming," he whispered. Peggy turned toward the road, where headlights appeared in the distance. A low, familiar rumble followed a sound she had come to know well. "It's Havoc," Snake said, backing away. "I've got to go." "Snake, wait!" Peggy called, but the boy was already running for his bike. He revved the engine once, casting a final look back at her before speeding off into the night. Peggy watched him disappear, her heart heavy. Snake was running from Havoc, but sooner or later he would have to stop running and face the truth. The motorcycles came closer, and Peggy didn't move. She stood tall, her posture straight, as the first bikes roared past her house. They slowed as they passed, their riders glaring at her from beneath their helmets. Havoc wasn't with them this time, just a handful of his men, riding slow, circling her house like wolves testing a fence. Peggy's jaw tightened. She could feel the message they were trying to send. "We're watching you." But Peggy Wilson had faced worse than intimidation. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, meeting their glares without flinching. After a few slow loops around her property, the riders peeled off one by one, their engines echoing through the night until silence returned. Peggy turned back to the house, her mind racing. Havoc was planning something, and Snake's warning had given her just enough time to prepare. Inside, she grabbed her phone and dialed Jack. "Jack," she said when he answered, "we've got a problem. Havoc's planning something big. We need to gather everyone now." By midnight, the Veterans Guard had assembled at the old town hall. Jack stood at the center, barking orders as his men prepared for whatever was coming. Sarah monitored a map of Riverstone, marking key locations and noting recent activity from Havoc's gang. Peggy paced in front of the group, her face set in determination. "Havoc's not done. Snake warned me tonight he's planning something to send a message to the town." "What kind of message?" Jack asked. "Destruction," Peggy replied grimly. "Something that'll make everyone afraid to stand up to him again." Jack's expression darkened. "Then we stop him before it happens." Peggy nodded. "We'll divide into teams and keep eyes on every major target business, the VA center, the school. Whatever Havoc's planning, we'll be ready." As the Veterans Guard prepared for the fight ahead, Peggy looked out at the gathered men and women. They were soldiers, veterans, survivors. And now they were protectors of a town that had almost given up hope. "Havoc thinks he owns Riverstone," Peggy thought as she stepped into the cool night air. "But he's about to learn that you can't break what refuses to be broken." The storm was coming, and Peggy Wilson would be ready. The darkness settled over Riverstone like a heavy blanket. The hum of nighttime insects filled the still air, but something unnatural hung beneath it, a quiet tension, as if the entire town were holding its breath. Lights were still on in businesses and homes across Main Street, but they glowed faintly, unsure of whether to comfort or to warn. At the Veterans Guard headquarters, Peggy stood in front of a map of Riverstone, her sharp eyes scanning the familiar streets and buildings she knew like the back of her hand. Around her, Iron Jack and his men were in motion, checking radios, gathering equipment, and tightening the loose ends of their preparations. "This is it," Jack said quietly, coming to stand beside her. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of what they all knew. Something big was coming. "You think Havoc will make his move tonight?" Peggy nodded, her expression steely. "He will. Havoc doesn't think in days or weeks. He wants revenge now." Sarah Chen walked in briskly, a tablet in her hand. "We've got eyes on every major location, the VA Center, Mason's Hardware, Diana's Diner, and the school. Teams are patrolling all exits out of town. If Havoc so much as blinks, We'll know. Jack grunted in approval. Good. He thinks we're vulnerable, but he doesn't know we're watching every move he makes. Peggy glanced at the team gathered in the room, men and women of all ages, combat veterans who had seen more battles than most could imagine. They were spread out across the room, some checking radios, others sharpening tools or oiling bike chains. These weren't people who fought for pride or power. They were protectors, plain and simple. "Stay sharp," Peggy said, her voice carrying through the room. "We're not out to win a fight tonight. We're out to protect this town." The group nodded, their focus unwavering. Jack gave Peggy a small nod, and together they headed outside into the cool night air. The Veterans Guard had split into teams hours earlier. Jack and his group took position outside Mason's Hardware, its newly repaired windows glowing faintly in the dark. Sarah and her crew patrolled near the VA center, keeping their eyes on every passing car and shadow that moved. Peggy, however, chose to station herself at Diana's diner. It wasn't because she believed it was the most vulnerable spot. It was because it felt like the heart of Riverstone, a place where neighbors met, shared stories, and found comfort in one another. "Are you sure you want to be here?" Diana asked softly, as Peggy sat at the counter, a fresh cup of coffee steaming in front of her. Diana glanced nervously out the window, her hands fidgeting with a dish towel. "If they're coming for you, maybe you should—" Peggy cut her off with a calm but firm shake of her head. "This is exactly where I need to be, Diana. They're not going to scare us out of the places we love." Diana sighed, then managed a small smile. "Well, at least let me make sure your coffee stays warm. If trouble's coming, we'll face it with full cups." Peggy chuckled softly, the warmth of the coffee reminding her of simpler days. She glanced out the window, her eyes sharp, and waited. It started with the faint sound of engines in the distance, soft at first, then louder, like thunder rolling across the hills. Peggy's heart tightened slightly, though her expression remained calm. She stood from her stool, stepping to the door. "They're here," she murmured. Outside, on the far end of Main Street, headlights appeared. Motorcycle engines growled and roared like wild animals, the sound echoing off the walls of the small town. The Shadow Vipers were coming. Jack's voice crackled through Peggy's radio. "They're moving in. Looks like at least 20 bikes plus 2 trucks. They're heading straight for Main Street." Peggy clicked the radio. "Copy that. Everyone stay in position." Diana swallowed hard as she stood behind Peggy, watching the headlights grow closer. "How many?" "Enough," Peggy replied simply. The trucks rolled in first, massive and loud, their tires screeching as they stopped at opposite ends of Main Street. The Shadow Vipers' motorcycles followed, circling the center of town like predators cornering their prey. Their engines idled menacingly, filling the air with the acrid smell of fuel and smoke. Havoc dismounted from his bike first, his boots hitting the pavement hard. He was a tall man, his black leather jacket marked with the same snarling red Viper insignia that Snake had worn. Havoc's face was twisted in anger, his eyes cold as they fixed on Diana's diner. "Come on out, Peggy!" Havoc's voice boomed through the street, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's settle this once and for all." Peggy stepped outside, her posture straight and unflinching. Jack and a few Veterans Guard members appeared at either end of the street, their bikes blocking the Viper's escape. Havoc's men noticed, their expressions shifting from cocky to wary. "You're making a mistake, Havoc," Peggy called, her voice calm but firm. "This town doesn't belong to you, and it never will." Havoc laughed bitterly, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his frustration. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a bunch of scared townsfolk hiding behind a bunch of old soldiers." Jack stepped forward then, his voice carrying across the street like a command. "You're outnumbered, Havoc. You and your boys need to turn around and leave while you still can." Havoc's sneer faltered, just for a second. He glanced back at his gang, many of whom were shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure of themselves. The sight of Jack's veterans disciplined, calm, and ready sent an unspoken message. The Vipers were dealing with something far more organized than they had expected. But Havoc wasn't finished. He pointed a finger at Peggy, his face twisted with anger. "You think this is over? You think you can humiliate me, make a fool out of us? We're not going anywhere, lady. Not until I take everything you care about." Peggy stared at him steadily, unblinking. "You've already lost, Havoc. You just don't know it yet." Havoc's face darkened. "You want to see loss? Fine." He turned sharply and barked an order to one of his men. The biker revved his engine and peeled off down the street toward the VA center. Jack's radio crackled with Sarah's voice. "One of them's heading our way fast." "Hold position," Jack commanded, his voice steady. Peggy clicked her own radio. "Sarah, make sure no one gets hurt. Havoc's trying to make this a fight." The trucks on either end of Main Street revved their engines, their exhaust pouring thick smoke into the air. Havoc's men began to spread out, circling with an air of unease. They were waiting, watching for Peggy or Jack to make the first move. Jack leaned in close to Peggy, his voice low. "They're trying to bait us." Peggy nodded. "And we're not taking it." She turned back to Havoc. "What happens next is up to you, Havoc. You can walk away from this, or you can dig yourself into a hole you won't climb out of." Havoc barked a bitter laugh. "This town's already in a hole, old woman. I'm just burying it." Before Havoc could give the next order, a shout echoed through the night. "Stop!" Every head turned toward the far end of the street, where a single motorcycle roared into view. Snake. The boy skidded to a stop in the middle of the street, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Havoc, stop this! It's over!" The gang froze, murmuring among themselves. Havoc turned slowly, his glare settling on Snake. "What did you just say?" Havoc hissed. Snake swallowed hard, his voice trembling, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't who we are. You think this makes you strong? You're wrong. Fear doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak." For a moment, silence filled the street. Havoc's face turned red with fury. "You little traitor." Snake's voice steadied. "I'm done, Havoc, and so are you." The street fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Snake's motorcycle idled in the middle of Main Street, its faint rumble the only sound cutting through the stillness. He sat rigid in his seat, his face pale but determined, his voice still echoing in everyone's ears. "I'm done, Havoc, and so are you." Peggy Wilson watched from the steps of Diana's diner, her sharp eyes fixed on Snake. He looked so small against the sea of leather-clad bikers, yet there was something powerful about the way he held himself, like a boy who had finally decided to stand. Havoc, however, was anything but impressed. The gang leader's boots scraped against the pavement as he took slow, deliberate steps toward Snake. His gang stood frozen, torn between Havoc's fury and the boldness of one of their own breaking ranks. "You really think you can come out here and embarrass me?" Havoc's voice was low and dangerous, his face dark with anger. "After everything I've done for you? For all of us?" Snake swallowed hard, his hands gripping the handlebars of his bike, but he didn't move. "You didn't do anything for us. You only ever did things for yourself." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. A murmur rippled through the shadow vipers, uncertainty written on their faces. For some of them, this wasn't the first time they had questioned Havoc's leadership, but no one had dared say it out loud. Until now. Peggy stepped forward then, calm and steady, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "Snake's right. Havoc, you've been lying to these men from the start. You tell them fear makes them strong, but all it's done is make you weaker. You're out here destroying businesses, threatening kids, and calling it respect." Havoc turned sharply to face her, his eyes blazing with fury. "You don't know what you're talking about, old woman." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Peggy replied, her tone unwavering. "Strength isn't about tearing others down. It's about building them up. Real strength is standing for something more than yourself." Havoc let out a bitter laugh, though it was clear he was losing control. You think you're so wise, don't you? You and your little army of old soldiers? What makes you think you can stand against us? Iron Jack's gravelly voice rang out from the other side of the street, calm but sharp as steel. Because we've already faced worse than you, Havoc, and we survived. The veterans' guard stepped forward in unison, emerging from the shadows where they had been stationed all night. They formed a line at either end of the street, their leather vests marked with military insignias, their postures relaxed but ready. Havoc's men shifted uneasily. What had started as an intimidating show of force had turned into something else entirely. The Shadow Vipers were outnumbered, their leader's rage beginning to work against him. "You're done here, Havoc," Peggy said, her voice quiet but firm. "Take your men and go." Havoc's fists clenched tightly at his sides. His face was a mask of frustration, his pride too big to admit defeat. "You don't give me orders," he shouted, his voice cracking with anger. "I'm the one in charge." Snake interrupted, his voice cutting through Havoc's rant like a blade. "Not anymore." Havoc turned back to Snake, his face twisting with fury. "You think you can take my place? You think these men will follow you?" "I don't want your place," Snake said firmly, shaking his head. "I just want out, and I'm not the only one." The ripple of murmurs in the gang grew louder. Diesel, Havoc's second in command, stepped forward, his expression conflicted. "Havoc, maybe it's time we call this off. Look around. We're losing. Half the boys are ready to walk." Havoc turned on Diesel, his face darkening further. "You too?" he snarled. "You're all cowards." Diesel met Havoc's glare without flinching. "No, Havoc, we're just tired of being afraid. Look at Snake. He had the guts to stand up to you. Maybe he's braver than any of us." Snake looked at Diesel with surprise, and Peggy could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. It was small, but it was there a sign that maybe some of these men could be saved. Havoc, however, wasn't ready to let go. He reached for the small detonator in his jacket pocket, the one he had brought as a last resort. "You think this is over? I'll show you what happens when you turn against me." "Don't!" Peggy's voice rang out like a command, freezing Havoc in place. The street went dead silent. The detonator hovered in Havoc's shaking hand, his eyes wild as he glanced between Peggy, Snake, and his own gang. "You pull that trigger," Peggy said slowly, her voice calm but firm. "And you prove to every man here that you're exactly what they're starting to realize, a bully who never deserved their loyalty." Havoc's hand trembled. Sweat trickled down his brow. Peggy took a slow step forward, her eyes locked on his. "Let it go, Havoc," she said softly. "It's over." For the first time, Havoc hesitated. His rage had carried him this far, but now, standing alone with his gang turning against him, the truth was undeniable. He had already lost. With a growl of frustration, Havoc hurled the detonator to the ground. It clattered against the pavement and rolled to a stop. His shoulders slumped, and the fight drained out of him. "It's over," Peggy repeated, her voice steady. Havoc turned to look at the gang he had once controlled, but their eyes were no longer on him. They were on Snake, Diesel, and the others who had spoken up. Some looked ashamed, others uncertain, but none of them stepped forward to defend their fallen leader. Slowly, the Shadow Vipers began to back away. One by one, they mounted their bikes and rode off into the night, leaving Havoc standing alone in the middle of Main Street. The detonator lay at his feet, harmless and forgotten. When it was over, Peggy turned to Snake, who stood beside his bike, his hands trembling. The boy looked up at her, his face pale but filled with something new, relief, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of pride. "You did good," Peggy said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You stood up for yourself, and you saved this town." Snake let out a shaky breath, his voice hoarse. "I thought he was going to kill me." "You were brave," Peggy replied. And sometimes bravery means standing alone, even when you're scared. Iron Jack walked up, his expression softer than usual as he looked at Snake. "Kid, you've got guts. If you want a place to start over, we've got room for you with the Veterans Guard. You could use a fresh start." Snake blinked, clearly overwhelmed, but after a long moment, he nodded. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." Peggy smiled faintly. "Good. You're not alone anymore." By the time dawn broke over Riverstone, the streets were quiet once more. Peggy stood on the steps of Diana's diner, watching as the first rays of light painted the town gold. Jack leaned against the railing beside her, his arms crossed. "We did it," he said quietly. Peggy nodded, her gaze sweeping over the town. "No, they did it. Snake, Diesel, the townsfolk. They just needed someone to believe in them." Jack chuckled softly. "Always so modest." Peggy smiled faintly, but said nothing. The quiet was peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, Riverstone felt like itself again. In the distance, Snake rode alongside a group of Veterans Guard members, his bike no longer a symbol of fear, but of freedom. Peggy watched him go, her heart swelling with pride. Havoc was done, and the shadow vipers had scattered. The storm had passed, but the lessons it brought would remain forever. Riverstone had proven something to itself, that unity, courage, and kindness could rebuild even the most broken places. And sometimes, the greatest victories came not through battles, but through the strength to stand together. The first light of morning broke over Riverstone, soft and golden, as if it were wiping away the shadows of the long night before. The town stood quiet now, though remnants of the storm lingered. Broken glass swept into neat piles, faded graffiti waiting to be scrubbed clean, and the lingering echoes of motorcycle engines that had finally gone silent. Peggy Wilson stood on her porch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee as she looked down the street. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Riverstone looked different now, still scarred, but somehow stronger, as if the town itself had stood up straighter overnight. The soft crunch of boots on gravel caught her attention. Iron Jack climbed the steps, his leather jacket worn and weathered, his expression carrying the weight of relief. "Quiet this morning," Jack said, taking a seat on the porch railing. Peggy nodded, taking a slow sip of coffee. "It's the kind of quiet this town's earned." Jack looked out at the street, where small groups of townsfolk were beginning to gather. Tom Mason leaned on the frame of his hardware store, his face relaxed for the first time in weeks. Diana swept the steps outside her diner, humming to herself as she prepared to reopen. Further down the road, Snake stood with a handful of Veterans Guard members, looking uncertain but welcomed as they handed him tools to help with repairs. "Snake's settling in," Jack said, following Peggy's gaze. "Kid's got a lot to learn, but he'll be all right." Peggy smiled faintly. "He made the hardest choice last night. The rest will come easier." Jack grunted his agreement. "Never thought I'd see one of Havoc's boys holding a hammer instead of a crowbar." "It's not where you start," Peggy replied softly. "It's where you decide to go." Jack looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You've done something here, Peggy. You didn't just stop Havoc. You gave this town back its heart." Peggy shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. This town just needed a little nudge, Jack. It was always strong enough to stand, it just needed to remember how." By mid-morning, the heart of Riverstone was alive again. Peggy walked down Main Street, her steps slow but steady as she stopped to talk to neighbors and business owners. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of repair and renewal. At Mason's Hardware, Tom worked alongside a handful of townsfolk and veterans, rebuilding what the Vipers had damaged. "Almost as good as new," he said proudly when Peggy walked up. "Took a lot of hands, but we're getting there." "That's how it should be," Peggy replied with a smile. "People helping each other." Tom wiped his hands on his work gloves. "Guess you were right, Peggy. Fear only has power if we let it. I won't let anyone take this town from us again." Further down the street, Diana's diner had reopened, the smell of coffee and fresh-baked pies spilling out onto the sidewalk. Diana waved Peggy in as she approached. "You're getting the first slice today, Peggy," Diana called, balancing a steaming apple pie on one hand. "On the house. You earned it." Peggy laughed softly as she stepped inside the diner, the sound of conversation and clinking plates filling the room. The atmosphere felt warm and alive, like Riverstone was breathing again. As Peggy sat down at her usual booth, Snake entered, his steps hesitant. His leather jacket was gone, replaced by a work shirt with his name stitched across the chest. He looked younger, somehow freer, though the shadows of his past lingered faintly behind his eyes. Peggy waved him over. "Sit with me, Snake." Snake hesitated, then slid into the booth across from her. He looked around the diner nervously. "Feels strange, being here like this." "That's because you're doing something new," Peggy replied gently. "It always feels strange at first." Snake rubbed the back of his neck. "Some of the guys Diesel, a few others, they want to come help. They don't know where they fit in yet, but they're trying." Peggy nodded, her smile encouraging. "There's always room for someone willing to change." Snake looked down at the table. I didn't think it was possible. Walking away, I mean. Havoc made us believe we couldn't." "Bullies do that," Peggy said softly. "They make you think they're stronger than they are. But it's a lie, Snake. It always has been." Snake looked up at her then, and in his eyes, Peggy saw the flicker of something new hope. "Thank you, Peggy, for not giving up on me." Peggy reached across the table and gave his hand a reassuring pat. "You saved yourself, Snake. I just gave you the chance." By afternoon, a gathering formed in the center of town. People of all ages, residents, veterans, shop owners, and even former members of the Shadow Vipers stood together in the warm sunlight. A small stage had been set up, and Peggy stood at its center, looking out at the faces before her. Iron Jack stood beside her, his arms crossed, but his expression proud. Sarah Chen watched from the front row, a clipboard in her hands, though for once she wasn't checking anything, she was simply smiling. Peggy stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and steady as she began. "1 month ago, this town stood at a crossroads. We could have given in to fear. We could have let the Shadow Vipers take everything we built. But we didn't. We chose to stand together." She paused, letting the words settle. The crowd listened intently, the quiet broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. "Fear is a powerful thing," Peggy continued. "It tells us to hide, to give up, to believe that we're alone. But we're not. We are stronger when we stand together. And that's what Riverstone proved." She looked out at the crowd, at the veterans who had once fought on distant battlefields, at the shop owners who had reopened their businesses, and at the young men like Snake who were trying to find their way again. "This town has scars," Peggy said, "but scars don't mean we're broken. They mean we survived. They mean we're stronger." Applause rippled through the crowd, growing louder as more voices joined in. Snake, standing near the back, clapped hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Peggy stepped back, allowing Iron Jack to take her place. His voice carried deep and strong as he addressed the group. "We didn't fight for Riverstone because we had to. We fought because this town is worth fighting for. And now, it's up to all of us to keep it that way." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Peggy walked back to her house with Jack and Sarah beside her. The streets of Riverstone were alive with the sounds of laughter, hammering, and conversation. "Looks like we made it through," Sarah said softly, looking around. "We did," Peggy replied, her voice full of quiet pride. "And this town is better for it." Jack gave her a sideways look. "You know, Peggy, you're not just a part of this town. You're its heart." Peggy smiled faintly. "I'm just an old woman who remembers what it's like to fight for something worth keeping." They reached her porch, and Peggy paused to look out at the street one last time. The shadows that had once brought fear were gone, replaced by a sense of peace and hope. Riverstone wasn't perfect, but it was healing. "Sometimes people just need a chance," Peggy said softly. "A chance to remember who they are and what they're capable of." Jack nodded. "And you gave it to them." Peggy didn't answer right away. She looked out at the horizon, where the sky was painted in hues of gold and purple. "We gave it to each other," she said finally. "That's what community is. That's what makes us strong." And as night fell over Riverstone, the lights stayed on, not in fear, but as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the promise of a new day. Months passed, and Riverstone blossomed like spring after a harsh winter. The scars left by the shadow vipers faded, not because they were erased, but because the people of Riverstone had chosen to rebuild not just their town, but each other. Snake had become a regular presence in town, working alongside the Veterans Guard as part of their community outreach. He no longer carried the weight of his old gang on his shoulders. Instead, he wore a quiet pride in the new life he had chosen to build. Mason's hardware was fully restored, brighter and more welcoming than ever. Diana's Diner was once again the heart of Main Street, where families, veterans, and even former Vipers gathered to share stories over fresh coffee and pie. The VA Center, with Sarah at the helm, had expanded its programs to help struggling youth find their footing, offering hope to those who had once felt forgotten. Peggy Wilson remained at the center of it all, though she would never take credit for it. To her, she had only done what needed to be done. On a warm summer afternoon, the town gathered once again, this time not to face a threat, but to celebrate a victory. The sun shone brightly as laughter and music filled the air. Children played in the park while volunteers added the final touches to a brand new mural on the side of Diana's Diner. The mural depicted Riverstone, its quiet streets, its shops, and its people wrapped in the protective embrace of an outstretched pair of hands. In the center, a small, simple quote read, "Strength through unity, peace through understanding." Peggy stood nearby, watching as the finishing strokes were applied. Iron Jack approached her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Looks good, doesn't it?" he said, handing her a cup. Peggy nodded, smiling softly. "It looks like hope." Jack looked out at the crowd, families, veterans, former gang members working side by side. "You know, Peggy, this town owes you everything." Peggy shook her head. "No, this town owed itself the chance to change. I just reminded them of that." Jack grinned. "You're still as humble as ever." Peggy chuckled, taking a slow sip of coffee as she looked around. Snake was playing baseball with a group of kids, his laughter ringing out over the field. Tom Mason was shaking hands with Diesel, the former Viper now helping at the hardware store. Diana was pouring drinks for volunteers, her smile as warm as ever. Riverstone wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Peggy stood at the microphone in front of the crowd. Her presence commanded attention, though her voice was gentle and calm. "This town has been through a lot," she began. "We've seen darkness. We've seen fear. But we also saw something stronger. We saw kindness. We saw courage. And we saw people willing to stand together for what's right." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Riverstone has proven that no matter how far we fall, we can rise again. That's what real strength is, not power over others, but the power to lift them up." The crowd erupted in applause, but Peggy simply smiled, stepping back. She didn't need the recognition. Seeing her town whole again was enough. As people began to disperse, children rode their bikes down Main Street, their laughter mingling with the hum of Veteran Guard motorcycles patrolling the town not as an intimidating force, but as protectors, brothers, and friends. That night, as Peggy sat on her porch, watching the last light of day fade into twilight, she reflected on how far they had come. Riverstone was still the same town, yet it had been transformed. Its strength wasn't in its buildings or streets, it was in its people. Peggy smiled softly to herself. Sometimes all it takes is one phone call, she murmured, and a little belief that people can be better. This story of hope, redemption, and resilience reminds us that no matter how dark things may seem, kindness and courage can light the way forward. If you enjoyed Peggy's journey and want to hear more inspiring stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss a new story filled with strength, perseverance, and heart. Click that subscribe button and join us for more tales that inspire and uplift. Until next time, stand strong, stay kind, and believe in the power of second chances.